Welcome to another in our series of foreign policy conversations here at the Perth U.S. Asia Center. My name is Gordon Flake, and I'm delighted today to be joined virtually by Darshana Baruah, a non-resident scholar at the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, but who is currently in Japan as a visiting fellow at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Darshana has received a grant to do a two-year book project looking at the significance or the strategic significance of islands in the Indian Ocean in particular. And she has long developed a real expertise in maritime issues, which has given her tremendous opportunities to collaborate with the Perth U.S. Asia Center in the past. We've been very fortunate to have Darshana visit Perth on numerous occasions for both our Japan conferences and other things we've done here, and have long tried to bring her down here with greater frequency. Those of us who are watching this from Australia will note that in addition to her work now currently in Japan, Darshana was previously the Associate Director and Senior Research Analyst at Carnegie India, where she led that center's maritime program. She also had spent some time in Australia. She was a parliamentary fellow at the Australian Parliament and a visiting fellow at the Australian National University, as well as with the Lowy Institute. I understand that, Darshana, you were supposed to be in Washington, D.C. this year in our COVID environment. That was not to happen, but one way or the other, you are the personal manifestation of the Quad in the time that you spent there. And we're really fortunate to have you share your insights with us today. I should also add that Darshana also was awarded what is called a PIFA, Person of the Future Award. And there's a long French word which I can't quite pronounce, that Darshana will help us with, I hope maybe, by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, has also been named a UK Next Generation Scholar. Prior to her work at Carnegie and her time in Japan, she also was with our close partner, the Observer Research Foundation, where she was associate editor of the South China Sea Monitor. Sorry for that long introduction, Darshana, but you've been really busy. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me for this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Gordon. That was a really kind introduction. And I'm really thrilled to be able to do this with you. It definitely would have been better if if circumstances would have allowed to be in Perth, because always looking for reasons to go down to Australia. But I'm really glad to be able to do this and to talk about issues that I have engaged and interacted with you over the years and have learned so much. So I'm really looking forward to talking about some of those issues today.
Well, the good news is that from your current perch in Japan, I think it's probably easier to imagine direct flights opening up between Tokyo and Perth before they open up between Delhi and Perth, or in that case, between Washington, D.C., however you might get to Perth. Darshana, let me start off with your most recent report, which I read, just released last month. It's by Carnegie Endowment. It's India and the Indo-Pacific, New Delhi's Theater of Opportunity. A tremendous report, which I recommend to anybody who's interested in maritime issues and India's role in maritime issues. But I have this fascination, knowing how difficult the process is, of going to the very last line of a report. So you put in, all the work into the report, and now you've got to kind of tie it off with a beautiful little bow. And your final sentence says, India's actions and deliverables in the Indo-Pacific will lay the foundation for its role in a new global security architecture. Now, clearly, that sets the context for what's happening in the future, but it also gives a sense for where you came from in terms of your writing and your research. Could you just give us a little bit of an overview of India's maritime security interests, its capabilities, how those capabilities and policies have developed over recent decades, and then more importantly, per that last sentence, what India's maritime strategies and our objectives are today?
Thank you so much, Gordon. Broad question overview. So it'll be a good way to kind of provide the overview on India and maritime security issues. So the sentence that you're referring to in terms of that, how and what India delivers on will lay the foundation for India's Indo-Pacific partnerships is really built on what I've talked about in the paper, which really is about in terms of how India came to came to really taking on the concept of Indo-Pacific, because initially there was a hesitation. And then coming on to taking on that, the role of partnerships, which is very critical for India, which has become actually, I think, at the core of India's Indo-Pacific approach. And finally, to its kind of a difference between its diplomatic rhetoric or diplomatic outreach in the Indo-Pacific and its military capabilities. And there's a little bit of mismatch in terms of that, where politically and diplomatically, India has been able to expand much faster and wider than, say, militarily. And it also somewhere ties down about your question in terms of what India's really strategy has evolved or policy has evolved over the years. And I think it's threat-based. If you look at India's kind of evolution of maritime security and policies, you'll see that it has mostly been based on where and how India has perceived threats. India's maritime partnerships have actually been pretty decent, even at a time when India wasn't really engaging much with the world. Some of India's oldest maritime engagements are in the 80s and 90s, including with the United States, which is today Malabar. Of course, Japan is a part of it, but that started in early 90s, and with Singapore. And over the years, it has grown. And I think today you're at a stage where you're basically looking to increase the complexity, you increase the complexity of the exercises, increase the level of the exercises, to kind of increase, I think, or have better understanding between the navies, because India did not interact with these countries that often. I mean, if you look back, despite Australia and India being Indian Ocean countries, right? I mean, we didn't have a naval exercise until 2015. Which is quite late compared. Both look at Indian Ocean, both look at Indian Ocean Rim Association, and are both part of other regional institutions. It's because you didn't feel the need for an interaction. There was no threat in the Indian Ocean. There was definitely no competition as such in the early 2000s. So India kind of operated in that mode where it focused more on being a first responder for HADR and search and rescue operations. So in the last 5 to 6 years, there is a increase in the number of maritime engagements, right? Like it's increased from not just Indian Ocean, Europe, Pacific, we moved to the Caribbean, Africa, East Asia. So we went from doing literally the most basic to doing a lot in just a matter of a few years. It's not possible to have the same synergy everywhere because of the lack of resources, because of the lack of capital. So what I meant at the end of it is that even though we have kind of cast a wide net under the Indo-Pacific approach, the issues that India chooses to focus on, the issues that India chooses to collaborate on, and the way it collaborates will define what it wants for its Indo-Pacific. I've quoted it in the paper is when it's a quote from I think in India's Ministry of External Affairs annual report last year or the year before, where it says that through the Indo-Pacific, basically India sees an increased role for itself. And that is really at the core of India's in Indo-Pacific, I think, interest, that an increased role it's upon. That's why I call it a theater of opportunity, because it provides India multiple options, multiple opportunities to be able to do something which otherwise is not possible through its capital or its kind of its resources.
Can we step back just a little bit and look at India's maritime capabilities? Because the truth is, when probably most people in the world think about India, they'll think of it as a continental power. They'll be very familiar with the Indian Army. And presumably, these expanding capabilities that you're talking about have been based on kind of a gradual growth in both reach and scope and numbers and numberships in terms of India's ability to kind of project itself, beyond just the Indian littoral, out into the Indian Ocean. So can you give us a broader overview? How should we understand India's maritime capabilities over, say, the last several decades?
Right. I think one of the things is also that you're right that most people are perhaps more aware about India as a continental power, but there's also that India is an Indian Ocean player, right? That you think about the Indian Ocean, you think about India, and but I think a lot of people are not aware how little is the Navy's budget in India's defense budget. I think last year it was 14%, 14 or 15%. So it's never been above 22%, I think. So in the last 10 years, 15 years or so, it's been somewhere between 13% and 18, 19%, right? And so it has had limited capacity in what it may have envisioned for itself. But again, the threats were so low and there was no competition, especially after the end of the Cold War, that India was able to actually do a lot from what was available. One of the positives in India's side was a lot of the littorals and island nations looked to India for security. And India had built on that based on cultural ties, based on diaspora. So it will be Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles. You were able to send ships there. You were able to kind of respond to threats and disasters, right? So that was helping build their coast guards like Mauritius. So India's played role in terms of kind of, in the post-independence era of the smaller island nations. India's had close relationship, whether it's through defense colleges, whether it's training, whether it's HADR, or whether it's rescue. I mean, Indian Ocean tsunami was one of the greatest example of that. And now India prides itself as a first responder. But India as a net security provider was actually first, I think, initially pushed by the Americans. It was somewhere in the late 2000s, 2009, I think, when the US started saying India should be a net security provider, that is to say it should be able to provide overall security to the Indian Ocean. India on its part, at least on document, in speeches, it may have happened earlier, but in terms of documents and writing down a strategy, it was only in 2015 that the Navy said that one of its goals is to be a net security provider. So it's fairly recent where India is saying that, look, okay, we're now going to be, because Indian Ocean also before was mostly, it would perhaps cut off with Mauritius and Seychelles. So the Western Indian Ocean, the eastern coast of Africa, the Southwest Indian Ocean was pretty empty in the sense it was very little presence. More was focused on the Northern Indian Ocean and Eastern Indian Ocean. And now you're looking at a coherent Indian Ocean presence. You're looking at Indian Ocean as a whole, as one geographic area. So you're looking at the East, you're looking at West, you're looking at North, and you're looking at South, and you're definitely looking Central. And in that, I think, again, in that, partnerships have come to play a big role where India has been able to sustain or send or do missions in partnerships, both big and small. And it is something that India is looking to develop and kind of build on. And I think that's what the opportunity that Indo-Pacific provides.
Fantastic. As you recall, I spent 25 years in Washington, D.C. before I moved here to Perth about 6.5 years ago. And when I was in Washington, I really had a hard time conceptualizing or even understanding, the rationale for the Indo-Pacific. I was definitely an Indo-Pacific skeptic. But part of that has to do with maps, right? I mean, if you have a US-centric map, the Atlantic Ocean in Europe is on the right hand of your map, and the Pacific Ocean is on your left. And rarely does it extend into the Indian Ocean, except for maybe to be cut off right at the subcontinent. When I arrived in Perth, immediately, of course, every map that we have, including the ones on my office wall, are Australia-centric, which really helps you understand the diagonal that is the Indo-Pacific, that wonderful kind of connection between Pacific and Indian Ocean. I was struck in your, report that you did for Carnegie last month. There was a lot of wonderfully Indian-centric maps that help us understand the Indian Ocean from a very different perspective, right? With the Indian subcontinent squarely in the middle, which then you kind of outlined quite clearly in terms of India's view of its role as a net security provider, not just to the Eastern Indian Ocean, which is close to us in Australia, but to the Western Indian Ocean. So let me look at the penultimate, the second to the last sentence in your report, and ask you to kind of explain a little bit more on that. The quote there is, "The Indian Ocean will continue to provide New Delhi an opportunity to raise its profile and secure its strategic interests, but the government must be open to new ideas and frameworks such as burden sharing models centered on issue-based partnerships. Such an approach will allow India to maximize its limited resources and capacities to better prepare for a new security environment." Can you help us understand what you mean by that in Indian Ocean, in particular, where the subcontinent is squarely in the center.
Right. No, so essentially on the whole issue-based and burden sharing model was based on the fact that we talk about the Indo-Pacific and we talk about the Quad a lot, right? And how the Quad and other like-minded countries can come together and kind of work towards just one goal. But if you look at just for example, if you just look at the Quad, the 4 countries, the priority theaters are different for each. For India, it's the Indian Ocean. For Australia, it's South Pacific. For Japan, it's East China Sea, South China Sea, and US is a little bit of all, right? And with countries like India and Australia, where you have limited capacity and where you have limited capital, when the priority will come, when the push will come, you will invest in your priority area, which is for India is the Indian Ocean region. India will first strengthen the Indian Ocean, its own abilities in the Indian Ocean before actually moving to another theater. Of course, there will things that will happen simultaneously. But when it comes to hard security, when it comes to really investments, it will be the Indian Ocean. So I don't think so that all 4 or even India's all partners have to wait until all of our policies perfectly align on the Indo-Pacific, because I don't think so that will happen, because our priorities and theaters are different, but we agree on issues. We agree on principles. We agree on the next architecture that we are willing to kind of live under. And those are the areas that I think India can work on. In terms of be open-minded and be creative, is because in a number of ways, India can make use of opportunities available, and one of that is I think the foundations are laid for it, which is with agreements like a LIMOA or logistics exchange facilities agreement that allows, if both countries want to utilize and use each other's kind of territories. And in that, I speak specifically of the island territories of the Indo-Pacific or the Indian Ocean. So if you have Cocos Keeling of Australia, you have Andamans of from India, you have Reunion from France, you have Diego Garcia from US, UK, you have Okinawa, you have Guam. So you do have these series of island territories. And if you're able to envision that in whether it's bilateral, I don't think so it'll go beyond bilateral at this point in time, but even in that, I think it provides a lot of opportunity and assets to kind of address issues that are important right now. At this point for the Indian Navy, a key priority area is maritime domain awareness, to be able to be aware what's coming in and going out of the Indian Ocean, to build that one common picture. And on in that, I think underwater subsurface vessels is another concern. What is really coming into it. And I think collaboration between, say, India and Australia using Andamans and Cocos is a perfect kind of, well, not perfect because there are political hurdles and there are other issues in there, but it's an opportunity if you want to utilize it and use some of that. So I think issue-based coalitions are, and burden sharing, because I think for Asia it'll be different, but then there are ways to work around it on issues while you manage and try and work through some of the issues within you, because also rules-based order, I don't think so everybody agrees on that. There's, in terms of rules, I mean, we have seen recently India actually being on the other side of some of the voting patterns, like Diego Garcia with Mauritius, right? India was not on the same side as the other 3 Quad countries. So there will be issues, there will be differences, there will be, each one of them has its own foreign policy priorities and strategic interests. So, but there are areas I think where it overlaps and it can be done.
Thank you. That's very good. You're absolutely correct that the Australia's capabilities and resources are very much focused on the South Pacific. One of our objectives sitting here in Western Australia in Perth, looking out on the Indian Ocean, we like to refer to ourselves as Australia's Indian Ocean capital, is to, as much as we can, kind of drag the attention from the East Coast over to the issues that you're working on, because in the end, Australia is also an Indian Ocean power. Right. If you think back to the search for MH370, it ended up being centered here in Perth in Western Australia, just because there's not only capability, there's reach, but there's also that perspective. So we very much applaud the work you're doing, and we're hoping to get more Australian attention, not less, on those islands and issues. Let me look on another issue right now, and that is some of the great power competition in which India is deeply engaged. The media over the last several months has been intensely focused on land border issues between China and India, particularly the tragic events that took place in Ladakh and the clash between Indian and Chinese troops, which led to a loss of life. That has been very much a focus, as has been the India-US relationship. What hasn't been nearly as much a focus, is how that great power rivalry and those great power relations between India and China, India and the US, are carried out in the maritime space. So I was wondering if you might help us understand that dynamic of great power relations.
Sure. In the Indian Ocean and maritime, I mean, of course, the Sino-Indian competition is increasing, it's expanding. Today, I think, especially after the Ladakh issue in June 2020, there has been an increase in the in commentary and media, which says, why isn't India leveraging its kind of maritime advantages, which is its geography and its capacity in the Indian Ocean region. But in terms of geopolitical competition or great power competition in the Indian Ocean, there's one thing that I find, which has come out through my research, is that, you know, in really checking unilateral actions or, you know, assertive actions by China, I think there is somewhere an assumption that everyone does and will find China problematic. But I think the region will play some role in shaping this great power competition. The littorals and the smaller islands will play some role in how and where this goes. If the littorals and the island states decide that it is in their interest to engage with China and have China present in the Indian Ocean, it's going to be harder to push back. I mean, of course, there's this whole question of debt traps, and there's this whole question of slow implementation. I mean, there's a number of issues which might not support their engagement with China in the long run, but in the short time, it can actually have a significant impact. I mean, it was something that shows with India-Maldives relationship between 2014 and 2018 was particularly challenging, when the government in Maldives really pushed towards China and suspended pretty much all projects with India. And that was also the time where you saw China really increase and deepen its engagements, which perhaps may have not been possible if the region hadn't welcomed China's presence, right? So I think, yes, India's relationship, India's great power competition, its engagement with US, China, Australia, Japan, France, UK would matter a lot, but will also matter how India, how Japan, how US, how Australia engages with the region, for which these countries are saying that I will be a security provider. You're providing security for the region, but what if the region wants something else? Right? So it has to be in conversation. And I think for the first time, the island themselves since independence, since they've stopped being colonies, in middle of a great power competition. And I think they are playing the game as well. They know what's in their interest, they're changing their identities. And I think that is something that needs to be taken into consideration when we talk about great power competition and just India-China competition in the Indian Ocean. It's not going to be simply shaped by the bigger powers. I think the smaller countries would have a role to play in it as well.
So let me ask again more specifically about the U.S. Obviously, the U.S. has a significant presence in the Indian Ocean with Diego Garcia. There have been very important naval exercises between India and the United States, Malabar among them. Can you just give us a better sense for the trend lines? Because again, all the attention in terms of India-U.S. relations are focused on the vagaries of the Trump administration and Trump's own relative popularity in India, his summit visit there, with an intense focus on trade. And I'm kind of curious as to where you see the U.S.-India naval or the U.S.-India maritime relationship going. Where is that likely to develop?
I think it will get stronger, the India-US maritime relationship. Politically also, it has been good in terms of whether it's show or whether it was actually led to something in terms of the political relationship. Both Modi's visit to US and Trump's to India was successful and it was well received. There was, signaling from a public perception point of view, it was really well, right? But there are, of course, issues like you're saying, trade and other issues. I mean, recently was this visa issues with students and H-1B and stuff. But actually, on the defense part of it, the maritime part of it has been gradually and steadily increasing and getting stronger. in whether it is on foundational documents. It's taking time, but it's definitely going more in terms of exercises, in terms of frequency of exercises, widening scope for it. India and US are now, I think, looking more towards more concrete focused issues such as intelligence sharing, anti-submarine warfare, using recently, just I think it was a week ago or so, India and US did an exercise off the Andaman Sea, which was using the aircraft carriers. So it's you're seeing more, although US-India exercise is not new, the level of the exercises are new. The level of the engagement is new. India and US have consistent maritime security dialogues. We have a number of conversations, engagements at various levels. So I think the relationship actually has, on the naval side, I would say, has gotten pretty strong. And I think I do see a trend of it going stronger, where it would be very specific to issues and areas.
So let me now move to India's east. India has long had kind of a look to east policy. Now it's trying to articulate that as an act east policy.
Right.
In May, India and Indonesia inked an agreement which was framed as an Indo-Pacific agreement. And then in June of 2018, Prime Minister Modi gave an extremely, or 2018, gave an extremely well-received speech at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which was widely seen as kind of the consolidation of the Indo-Pacific movement writ large. And yet there's some real complexities as India continues to focus on Southeast Asia, particularly in the maritime space. As you're well aware, because you've done so much research and writing on it, the South China Seas are an area of great contestation, particularly when it comes to questions of territory. When the UN tribunal, the permanent tribunal, came out with their ruling on the Philippines claim, India was, at least to my recollection, relatively quiet, in contrast to, say, Japan, Australia, and the US, which were quite vocally in support of that. I'm curious how the India, given its own focus and priority on the Indian Ocean, looks at the increasingly complex legal issues, which nevertheless are precedent-setting issues in the South China Seas. You know, as you've got claimant states like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, all of which have increasingly close and important relationships with India. Can you help us kind of understand that dynamic as India continues its act east and faces up the challenges in Southeast Asia?
Sure. The 2016 ruling, the PCA ruling, when it came out, India was actually one of the first countries to put out a statement in favor of the ruling. So in fact, I think it took a lot of us by surprise, because I thought that India either was not going to say anything, or was going to say something very vague. But India was clear in the terms that it didn't take China or Philippines' position or name as such, but it essentially said, it basically spoke up in support of international rules and national norms. And it supported the verdict, it supported the ruling. And also, this was, I'm not sure if it was 2014 or 2015, a similar thing happened between Bangladesh and India, where on the maritime dispute, Bangladesh took India to court. The verdict was in favor of Bangladesh and against India. And India accepted that verdict. India accepted that rulings. In fact, I think Philippines used this as an example while making a case during its hearing, that from the point of view of big power and a small power neighbors, you know, how it can be settled. So India's voice on the South China Sea has been primarily political in terms of, and diplomatic in terms of speeches, or in terms of support with partner nations. I remember in 2015, in an India-Philippines joint statement, India, on request from the Philippines, referred to the South China Sea as the West Philippine Sea, because that's what the Philippines says. So it has been in terms of very bilateral, and it has been more vocal in terms of rules-based order, in terms of international order, UN and UNCLOS and all of that. I think that is likely to continue, where India will lend a lot of support bilaterally or multilateral forums. But I think the disappointment or the kind of the questions for India in South China Sea comes from, you know, where is the teeth? Like, you know, okay, are you really going to show up here? are you going to show up in the region and do something if things go seriously wrong? And I think that's a question that India at different levels have grappled with. And at point, India's standing was that unless ASEAN together comes forward and says, we want India engaged in this issue, we're not going to go and do that, which also somewhere could be an excuse because, ASEAN is not going to come together, 10 nations saying that, yes, we want this happening. And this was during the time when ASEAN had a lot of internal issues. But I think I do see some changes. For instance, it was 2019 when US, India, Japan, and Philippines sailed through the South China Sea together. But it was because the ships were present, the coordination happened. It was logistically it made sense. It wasn't FONOPs. I don't think so. India is going to go under a FONOP. I don't think so. India is going to go under a coalition or an alliance, kind of to sail through the South China Sea. It will continue to deploy. It will continue to be present. But I don't think so. It's going to be as frequent and as sustained as it would be in the Indian Ocean region. Having said that, I think India does have areas to put out a more of a presence, in the sense that, for instance, with Japan, right? India and Japan does GIMAX, the annual bilateral exercise, Japan and India, where it happens either off the coast of Japan or India. And one of the ways India can, if it's about signal, if it's about saying that India has access, if it's about power projection, or even to say that India is interested in the region, is to have an exercise off Okinawa, or to have an Indian P8 fly to Okinawa and do an exercise, which is incredibly close to Taiwan, which is a pressure point, right? And so there are ways to send messages if it is to be done. It's a one-off exercise. It's not something sustained, but it could increase India's presence through a partner which welcomes India, instead of India doing it by itself. India and Japan has a relationship that could be taken up. But of course, these are political decisions. Okinawa is sensitive. There's American presence there. So it has a lot of, but if India and Japan wants to do it, the foundation, the agreements, the basis exist.
It's going to be very interesting to see the continued development of Japan-India cooperation. And again, a good sign to that, obviously, is your presence there in Tokyo and the research you're working on. So we're very much looking forward to your forthcoming book, and we'll have another conversation when we get to that book as well. Let me note that you will be familiar with both our previous interaction and your time in Canberra, that one of the mantras of Australian foreign and defense policy is rules-based order. And so I had not focused much on the India-Bangladesh ruling when it came to a territorial dispute. And I think that's going to be a very important thing, because underpinning the concept of a rules-based order is a repudiation of the old notion that might makes right. And so for a much larger, more powerful, influential country to accept a ruling based on the rules-based order is a very, very powerful example, and I think that we ought to be talking about more when we're talking about South China Seas. Now, let me wrap up by bringing things home to Australia. As you're aware, there is a strong and I think rapidly improving relationship, both on the diplomatic side, but particularly on the defense side, between Australia and India. There was a recent virtual summit between Prime Minister Morrison and Prime Minister Modi. Just a few weeks ago, Australia launched a strategic update to its previous defense white paper called the 2020 Australia Defense Update, which really gives you a sense for kind of what Australia is thinking about, and obviously with a heavy focus on the Indian Ocean. I was wondering if you might just kind of help us wrap up by thinking, how do you see Australia's role in the various issues you're working on? So what is Australia's role in the Indian Ocean, in maritime space more broadly? And then finally, if you kind of look at the opportunities for greater cooperation between Australia and India.
Sure, thank you. That's actually a great question in terms of the two parts. I want to start by something that I realized in my kind of research in the Indian Ocean for the book, which was that in the Indian Ocean, which was of course again focused on the island nations, but just going across the region, what I realized is there's a lot of history, whether it's with France, whether it's with India, there's a lot of history between these littorals and island states with their primary security partner. With France, it's the colonial baggage. With India, it's, taking it for granted. The two countries which are viewed positively and is welcomed are Japan and Australia. Almost every island nation in the Indian Ocean, I traveled from Sri Lanka to Madagascar, said, why not have more collaborations with that? So I think somewhere, if there is a more of challenges in the Indian Ocean or France, which are the two other powers holding down East and Western Indian Ocean, I think there's a role that can be played with Australia and Japan on issues that are of interest, which brings to the bilateral relationship and what can be done. One is regional institution, which has a strong focus both in India and Australia through IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association. I think that's something that will continue. And in both India and Australia places a lot of importance on ASEAN as an institution in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that will be one way of that I see collaborations that's going to go on. The second is also not just bilateral, but a range of initiatives that Australia and India have initiated and the other has supported. The Coalition for Disaster Relief Infrastructure, disaster resilient infrastructure was an initiative that India announced last year on the sidelines of UNGA. And Australia was one of the first countries to support it and become a founding member, saying, okay, we need to be able to provide this to the region and work on that. Similarly, International Solar Alliance, India started the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. First country to support, one of the first was Australia. I think another area where India-Australia relationship can actually exchange lessons and borrow lessons from each other is in the capacity building efforts on both Indian Ocean and South Pacific. Because Australia does a lot of it in the South Pacific, India does a lot of it in the Indian Ocean. The issues are the same at the core. Most islands and the littorals, they face similar issues on maritime, whether it's illegal fishing, whether it's climate change, whether it's humanitarian disaster or natural disaster. The issues are same. I think there's a lot that can be exchanged on these efforts that could go across, making it actually an Indo-Pacific effort than just the Indian Ocean and the Pacific effort. Australia's search and rescue zone in the Indian Ocean is massive. It spans across from Sri Lanka down, and so I think, and India prides itself on that, on being a first responder. That's another area where India and Australia can work together in look to kind of strengthen that area. The one that I am interested in right now is use of island territories, which is really using Cocos Keeling and Andamans for kind of MDA and AHW missions, because it really is kind of two ends of a string under which any subsurface vessels would have to cross by. And I think that provides a lot of advantage and it's an opportunity to really work together on something that is of interest to both countries, and you both have the assets. And individually it might not be enough, but together it actually is a really good opportunity. And finally, on the trilateral partnership, I think India, Australia, France partnership is something that would be interesting, and that might have a lot of common areas. France's biggest maritime boundary is with Australia and Southwest Indian Ocean. India and France has one of the longest and oldest maritime relationship. I think our exercise of Baruna was first initiated in the 80s, which was much before then it was done with the US or anybody else. There are issues that are common, there are issues that are of interest. The lack of capacity is similar in terms of the challenges, but together I think there's an opportunity that's available. So there are areas on which I think Indonesia is another trilateral partnership. Europe is another one that can be looked at. So I think there are various moving parts that can be coordinated. I think somewhere both India and Australian governments are moving toward that. Just one last final thing in terms of Indian Ocean security that I want to mention. I think the missing debate on this, or not missing, but then maybe the lesser talked about, is the Africa angle. In the Indian Ocean, right? The eastern coast of Africa, anybody with an interest in Africa would have to take that into account, because their concerns are maritime on the eastern coast. So you have, but then the moment you say Africa, you go to the continent and you forget about the eastern coast of Africa, which is the Indian Ocean. And then you don't talk about that. You haven't taken that into consideration. Some of the island nations are members of African Union. They are members of Indian Ocean Rim Association. Then others are member of South Asia kind of sub-region, but are a member of IRA. So there are multiple different groupings going on within that. And now most of them have chosen to take on a new identity instead of calling themselves just an African or just a South Asian nation. They say we're an Indian Ocean country because your opportunities are higher, your opportunities are wider. The number of people interested in South Asia will always be less than the number of countries interested in the Indian Ocean, which is wide. So it gives them a strategic kind of reach and widens their scope. So I think that is one bit of that. And it doesn't have to be military. There are a number of issues that are already exist and it can be built on and extended to that. I think that's one thing that's missing, even in relationship to Japan, who talks a lot about Japan-Africa relationship, but hasn't really looked at the maritime side of it, which is a real interest to those countries.
Well, thank you. That's eye-opening, and it really expands kind of the spectrum, and it goes back to the map that you had in your Carnegie paper that really kind of gives you a sense for how you're looking at the world, and it is framed by where you set the boundaries. Look, normally when I end up a conversation like this, I will indicate how much I'm looking forward to the end of the travel restrictions that have come with COVID, and how much we look forward to hosting you here in Perth again in person. But in your case, it's a little bit different. It's worth noting that the Cocos and Keeling Islands are both administered out of Western Australia. And at least prior to the COVID shutdown, the direct flights that all came out of Perth. And so what I'll say is that I hope that we can continue this conversation on the Cocos and Keeling Islands not too long in the future. That would aid your research. It would be certainly an interesting place for a conversation looking at island territories. We, again, congratulate you on the excellent paper you did for Carnegie. We'll put a link up when we release this video so people can look at that report. And we're very much looking forward to your upcoming book that you're working on there with Saskatchewan Peace Foundation. Let me end by noting that in the 6.5 years that the Perth US Asia Center has been doing programs and events, one that really sticks in my mind was in the second half of the year in 2017. India's Navy commissioned a sailboat called the INSV Tarini. And they staffed the entire sailboat with women sailors from India's Navy, many who never had sailed before, had come from landlocked parts of India, but who went through a rigorous training down in Goa at the naval base there, highlighting the maritime links between Western Australia and India. The first port of call for that wonderful crew after having left Goa was here in Fremantle, here in Perth. And we were fortunate to host the crew of the INSV Tarini. And I have to say, it's probably one of the more enjoyable events we've ever done, because you had this sense that it was like, you know, what it must have felt like in the 1960s to meet astronauts. There was this incredible adventurous spirit among this crew who were excited and dynamic and ultimately completed a circumnavigation of the globe before returning to India in 2018. That inspired, I think, a lot of us here in Western Australia. In the same way, Darshana, your research, your articulate and passionate advocacy for a deeper understanding of the maritime space is something that has benefited the Perth US Asia Center. And I hope through this video and your other research will benefit our broader community. So thank you. Thank you for your time. We look forward to future conversations.
Thank you so much, Gordon. This was wonderful. And to say, I mean, you know, even at a time when perhaps maritime security issues and conversations were not that trendy as it is today, you have been one of the people who have continuously supported a lot of my work and really encouraged. So for that, I'm very, very grateful to you. And it has allowed me to really explore the India-Australia relationship as well as the Indo-Pacific questions. So in many ways, thanks to a lot of kind of senior scholars such as you, who has made a lot of this possible. So I'm really thrilled to be able to do this conversation with you today. And I, of course, absolutely look forward to more conversations and engagements and find any reason and every reason I can to get down to Perth.
Cocos and Keelings, that's where we're meeting.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Great.